Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, episode 830. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about orcas, whale watching and wineries, kayaks, hikes, and a war about a pig as we go to the San Juan Islands and Whidbey Island in Washington State. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about the islands in the Puget Sound. I'd like to welcome to the show Alex Shoemann from the Seattle area, who's come to talk to us about the San Juan Islands. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Happy to be here.
Now, I'm guessing the fact that I said you're from the Seattle area gave us a little clue where the San Juan Islands are, but where are the San Juan Islands?
Great question. They're a chain of islands in about the most northwestern corner of the lower 48. So they're about 100 miles northwest of Seattle.
Excellent. And for those people who get really technical, I think you're going to talk about the San Juans and then a couple other things that are in the Puget Sound but are not technically the San Juan Islands. Is that right?
That's right. There's a very technical geographical definition for what's a San Juan Island. But generally, a lot of people will refer to all the islands in the Puget Sound as kind of San Juan Islands. But a few of them are just islands in the Puget Sound, not technically San Juan Islands.
Okay.
But all very beautiful.
Why should someone go to the San Juan Islands?
I think when people think of the San Juan Islands, the first thing they often think of is the wildlife. And so it's a really world-class destination for wildlife. The southern resident orcas, which we'll definitely talk about are a group of orcas that are in the San Juans year-round. So they've called the San Juans their home. So they're, I think, the most famous attraction in the San Juans. There's also quite a bit of great birding. It's the, I think, highest concentration of bald eagles in the lower 48 as well. So the wildlife is pretty astounding. And then it's a really beautiful natural setting. It's a chain of islands in this inlet that is the Puget Sound. And then to your west and your east, you're surrounded by big snowy peaks. And then the islands themselves are covered in Douglas fir forests. So it's a beautiful setting for a vacation. And then the part that people may not know about as much is the sensibility of the islands is very relaxed and laid back. And so it's a place where you can have a great outdoor adventure, but then also relax quite a bit and know you're going to be very comfortable at the end of the day, and you'll also be able to get a great meal. So it's a really great place for that type of relaxing but also adventurous trip.
Excellent. And what kind of itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
Yeah. So I am pretty partial to Orcas Island, which is the largest San Juan island right in the center of the chain. So would recommend visiting Orcas as your primary base. And then imagine most folks will be coming from the Seattle area. The thing you do when you visit an island is you have to get onto the island. I believe most people will likely be coming from either Seattle or maybe Vancouver, British Columbia. Their San Juans are about in the middle of those two places. And so the ferry terminal is in the town of Anacortes, which is in northern Washington, where you pick up the ferry. You can make reservations, which everyone will recommend you do, especially if you're coming in the summer for the ferry. Right. And it runs a handful of times per day. And most of the ferries that visit the San Juans will visit multiple islands. And that is typically kind of the first thing you'll need to do to get out there. So that I would recommend looking up in advance, looking at timetables, things like that. The way I've generally tried to play the ferry is just to make sure you get the earliest one you feel comfortable getting up for. So you
meaning that there's another one afterwards, just in case you missed the.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was going to say the last time we've been, the last time my wife was there, I've only been there once. She's been there a couple of times. We had it all timed out perfectly, flying into Seattle, catching some lunch, driving up to Anacortes in a casual, leisurely fashion, and then our flight was delayed 2 hours. So it ended up being, get the rental car and drive like hell to get up to Anacortes and literally be the last car on the ferry going over. Yeah, it's good if you have a little time buffer built into your schedule there.
Yes.
Because it's a little more than an hour, not counting traffic.
Yes, it's a pretty good drive up there. There's actually quite a bit to see on the mainland near where you catch the ferry. So if you do get there substantially early or you do want to, on either end, do something, the Whidbey Island and Deception Pass State Park are not far from there, which we'll talk about later. And then the tulips and the Tulip Festival in the spring of Washington are really close to where you catch the ferry.
Oh, okay.
And then there's some pretty cool kind of coastal hiking as well. So definitely some things to check out if you do have more time and time the ferry perfectly and then end up showing up early. But that's, I think, one of the more intimidating parts of visiting any island, especially if that's not the only component of your vacation, is how do I get out there and how much time do I need to set aside to catch the ferry? It's pretty easy as long as you plan to show up early.
Right.
Do your research ahead of time.
We were visiting friends. We were out in Friday Harbor, so one island over from Orcas there. But our friends who live on the island, I would say, have a love-hate relationship with the Washington ferry system. I mean, it's quite an extensive system. Generally works very well, and then sometimes not, apparently. But
yes, yeah. There's some crazy stats. I don't know enough of the crazy stats about the Washington ferry terminal system, but it's all public transit. It's subsidized by the state and is a pretty interesting investment the state has made to make all the islands accessible and to obviously serve the folks that actually live there.
Excellent. So you got us on a ferry. We're in Anacortes, and we're heading out to Orcas Island.
Yes, that's right. So Orcas Island it's almost shaped like an octopus. It's got prongs coming out from a central body. And so throughout the island, there are several different places to stay. But the primary town is really on the northern end of the island and is called East Sound. And so a number of the more famous inns are located in East Sound. And the Outlook Inn is a great one. So that's generally a good spot to use as your home base. As I've said, it's a very comfortable place to visit, a very relaxing place to visit. There are great options for kind of all budgets in the San Juans. I've done the San Juans in a hostel, and I've done for special occasions and anniversaries as well. A place where you can camp. There's great camping on Orcas Island over near Doe Bay, but would ultimately recommend folks first get in. The ferry will likely be your morning activity, and so you may want to stop in for lunch before exploring the island further. And East Sound is a great home base for getting a bite to eat and getting your bearings on the island.
Okay. And is there a particular place or two that you would recommend in terms of getting a bite to eat while we're on the island?
For lunch in East Sound, Brown Bear Bakery is definitely a great spot to hop in on. Great coffee, great baked goods, and then they also do pretty good sandwiches. So that's a good spot in East Sound. Generally, the food on the islands is quite good. Most of it is very local. So a lot of good ingredients. The islands are pretty agriculturally focused. And so a lot of the food that you'll find in the restaurants is around on the islands. A lot of menus at restaurants are changing, if not every day, week to week with what's in season. So there's quite a few good options, but Brown Bear Bakery for lunch, definitely. And then Mattia is one of the favorites we have in East Sound for evening bites.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So we've got there. We've had some lunch. Now what are we up to?
One of the big reasons I love Orcas is it's one of the better islands in the San Juans for hiking. And so would recommend heading out to Turtleback Mountain Preserve, which is over on the west side of Orcas Island. It's got the second tallest prominence or summit on the island. There's actually two relatively large mountains on Orcas Island, and so Turtleback is one of them. And as you climb up to that, you'll have a great view out to the west of San Juan Island, where you were on Friday Harbor. And in the very far distance, Vancouver Island, and then just other smaller islands in the chain. So that's a great place to go for a bit of a hike. You'll get a sense for the entire setting of the San Juans and be able to get that view. If you're not seeing bald eagles and other things like that on Turtleback, you may not be looking up. It's a great spot for bird watching and things like that. So would recommend doing that, kind of getting your bearings on the first day, and then kind of getting set up for whale watching on day 2.
Okay.
I think that would be generally the whole ferry component. Visiting East Sound, getting a hike in would probably be a pretty good first day. And then on the second day, I would definitely recommend checking out whale watching if you're interested in that.
Okay.
As a component, I think it's a really cool thing to do. The outfitters out there are definitely doing it the correct way. And it's one of those types of things where I don't think realize how incredible it could be until you get to experience it. So would definitely recommend checking that out. It's generally a pretty long activity. It could take an entire morning or entire afternoon to do. And so you head out on a boat with a naturalist and then, a crew that takes you out into the sound looking for orca. And it can take anywhere from 90 minutes to 2 hours to actually find where they are. They generally aren't just right offshore. And then you get to spend a certain amount of time with the whales and then drive back. It's a great way to see a lot of the surrounding area, and then obviously a great way to see the whales relatively up close. But I do recommend bringing binoculars and the telephoto lens.
There are really rules how close they can get to the whales.
Yes, exactly. And the engine has to go off as soon as they're within a certain amount of distance and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And those boats leave from Orcas on Orcas Island?
Every island is going to have, or the main 3, Lopez, San Juan, and Orcas will all have tours leaving from their islands. Yeah. There are boats that leave from just north of East Sound. There's a harbor on the north end. Okay. And then I believe on the west side of the island as well, near Deer Harbor, they also leave from there.
Okay.
Yep. So a number of different outfitters, but the experiences, I think, are pretty similar across them. And I think they all also share information amongst each other no one is monopolizing the whales on any given day.
Okay.
So pretty cool experience. If you're there in certain times of the year, they guarantee that you'll see them, or if not, you can come back the next day.
Now, if you're there in certain times of year, also, you're going to get the migration of whales through the area.
Yes.
Of other types of whales besides the orcas.
That's right. Yep. And then I think April and May are the primary months they recommend for gray whales, in addition to the orcas. And then April to September is prime whale watching time.
Okay.
But yeah, the southern residents, the resident is in their name because they are posted up in the area. So they're there year round. And if you're lucky, you'll also see them from shore potentially, which we've gotten to do from San Juan Island, which is a really cool experience as well. But there are a few spots on really all the islands that are solid for whale watching that locals will tell you could potentially see whales from there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. What's next?
So after that, you may want to come back into town and grab lunch as well. And then on the east side of the island is Moran State Park, which is the other big prominence on Orcas Island. And so would recommend checking that out. Mount Constitution is the central mountain peak within that state park. And so you can drive to the top or hike to the top. There are a few different hikes. that don't necessarily start at the bottom and go all the way to the top. It's actually a relatively large peak. But several ways to visit the top. And at the top, you have incredible views of really the entire surrounding area because it's the tallest prominence in the region. So you can see all the way to Vancouver. You can see Mount Baker and Mount Rainier and the Cascade Range to the east and the south. You can see the Olympics, and then you can see all the peaks on Vancouver Island as well. So it's a really cool spot to just see all of the San Juans unfolding in front of you with all the kind of cool volcanic peaks of the Pacific Northwest. So definitely a cool spot on a pretty day. And then there's a couple other fun hikes within that state park. Cascade Falls is another one. That's a relatively brief waterfall hike. And there's a few lakes within the state park as well.
You say on a pretty day, and that begs the question of when to go. You live in an area not known for its sunny days.
That's right.
It has lovely sunny days. Don't get me wrong. It just doesn't have as many of them as some places do.
That's right.
I don't know what the weather is in the San Juans compared to, for instance, Seattle, and if there's a particular time of year that you'd recommend for this trip.
So the weather in the San Juans is, I think, arguably slightly better than the actual Seattle area. The San Juans are in the rain shadow of the Olympics and then the mountains that are on Vancouver Island. And so it gets some benefit from those mountain ranges. So it doesn't get quite as much precipitation as Seattle, but clouds will still be there. So it is still gray for longer stretches of the year than many places. Generally, though, the summers in the Seattle region are pretty dry. And it's especially been that way in recent years. And so the summer, though, doesn't necessarily truly start until July, which I think is different from some places. So April, May, and then we call it June gloom.
Sure, we've got that.
Yep, you're familiar in the Bay Area, right? And so the April, May, the days will be warmer. You'll most likely have some days with sunshine in April and May, but you may also have a couple days that are pretty wet. And June can be pretty similar. But by July, August, September, I'd argue that you're more than likely to have a fully dry vacation if you come in July, August, or September. And I think September is really a great month for exploring the area because the temperatures are quite nice, generally pretty dry, and it's not quite as busy as peak summer.
Okay.
Yeah. Any of those would be a great time to come. So do recommend doing that on the east side of the mountain. And then while you're out there, either on the way or on the way back, there's actually a artist co-op near the state park called the Orcas Island Artworks. And so there's a number of different artists with tons of different mediums who all show their work within that co-op. I believe the building they have is an old strawberry packing factory. So a neat space, cool place to actually meet some of the artists themselves because it's a co-op, so they run it themselves. And a great way to get into the feel of the community, which is very much a maker and creative community. So definitely recommend checking that out on the way out there. And then there's another good, more seasonal spot for food called Buck Bay Shellfish Farm. So generally with anything on the San Juan Islands, definitely check the hours if you're planning to go really any time outside peak summer. A lot of the businesses are more seasonal, but Buck Bay Shellfish Farm is a great spot for a summer bite.
Okay.
Konnichiwa, I'm Yuki, a tour leader with Explore. Who knew that hidden among Tokyo's towering skyscrapers was a peaceful tea house surrounded by ancient trees and serene ponds? Actually, I knew. It was my mother's secret sanctuary. Not everyone knows about Tokyo's Hamarikyu Gardens. Arigatou gozaimasu. But you will if you explore. Search exploreworldwide.com. And don't just travel, explore.
These are violent criminals, so they're not going to go down easy.
ABC Tuesdays.
Let's get this done.
The Rookie is back.
We have 2 new rookies starting today.
Howdy.
Being a cop is stressful 24/7. Every year on the job is different.
And Training Day
We have a serial killer at large.
never ends.
We need an ambulance!
The Rookie. All new Tuesdays on ABC and stream on Hulu.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit Shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
So that one I would recommend for day 2. And then on day 3, one of the really fun parts about visiting the core of the San Juans is you can get from island to island. And after a couple days on Orcas, I would recommend checking out San Juan Island and checking out Friday Harbor and Roche Harbor. So you can do that through the same Washington ferry. The exact timetables will vary, but generally it's easier to get back to the mainland than it is to hop from island to island. So we would definitely recommend doing the research ahead of time on which ferry you can get on to head to the next one.
Not that it's longer, just that there are not as many ferries going island to island.
Yes, that's right.
Got it. Okay.
Yep.
Because you can see one to the other.
Yes, you can. Yeah. And you could kayak it or hire a smaller boat if you were interested in doing that. That's another option. Yeah. For anybody who's interested in a trip where you propel yourself by kayak, this is probably one of the greatest destinations in the world for that. Lots of smaller islands with campgrounds and things like that you can kayak to, and then you can kayak from island to island. And then great biking as well. And a lot of really cool bike tours in this area. Obviously, you need to get your bike on the ferry, but another great way to see it.
And anything particular you're going to recommend we see in San Juan Island?
Yes.
Okay.
San Juan Island is a little bit flatter than Orcas Island. So if you are going to bike for a day, which I would recommend, I'd recommend doing it on San Juan Island as opposed to Orcas. Orcas will be a more challenging biking experience for sure. And so if you do want to see some of the islands by bicycle, I'd recommend renting one in Friday Harbor. You can do that. There's a bike shop right walking distance from the ferry terminal. And then there are a couple really cool vistas that are, I believe one's a state park and the one's actually part of a national monument. But we biked down to South Beach, which is on the very southern end of San Juan Island. And that's one of the places I've seen whales from the shore before. So another tip for anyone visiting the San Juans is to always have binoculars with you.
Sure, that's a good idea.
Yep. Seeing them through binoculars is a lot more interesting than just being aware that that's what those shadows are. And the South Beach has got some of the more interesting history on the island.
Yes.
San Juans generally have some very interesting history, but there is what's called American Camp there, and then 4th of July Beach. So one of the first kind of American encampments in the San Juans was there. A lot of the San Juans are actually, in terms of the first European settlers, were settled by Hudson Bay Company. And they were somewhat in contention between the United Kingdom and the United States for a good period of their history.
Poor surveying done in terms of where the border went. There were 3 different ideas of where the border went relative to the San Juan Islands. And in 2 of those versions, San Juan Island would have been British when they finally settled the border. You may notice it is not, but we almost get in a war with England over a pig.
That's right.
So yeah, it's
right.
It's interesting history, as you said.
Yes, definitely. But it's a great spot for if you bike down there. You could walk around the beaches down there. A lot of wildflowers actually before you get to the sand itself, and then good spot for a picnic. And you have a tremendous view of the Strait of San Juan de Fuca and the Olympics to the south from that beach. So that's definitely a cool spot. And then would also recommend a similar spot, but on the western side, is Lime Kiln Park. And that, I believe, is a spot that folks recommend you can also see whales from. We only saw porpoises and otters from Lime Kiln Park. But
what a shame when you have to settle for porpoises and otters.
Yes.
But yes, the locals on the island said Lime Kiln State Park was their favorite spot to go for seeing whales from the shore.
Yes. And that's another great spot if you're visiting San Juan Island and not Orcas Island and you're staying the evening. That's a great spot for sunsets because it does face west.
Okay.
And you can see Vancouver Island in the distance. Lots of good vistas in the San Juan. And so with that, if you've kind of done that bike tour, maybe coming back to Friday Harbor for a late bite and then ultimately getting back to Orcas would make that a fun day trip. And
the other thing I would recommend in Friday Harbor is the Whale Museum. The
Yes.
Whale Museum in Friday Harbor is an interesting introduction to the resident orcas in particular. More information about those whales, but of the other whales in the San Juans.
Yes.
It's not a big museum. It won't take you more than probably an hour to go through, but a very nice little museum.
Yeah. And I think they have a map of recent sightings and lots of different cool information. Yeah. So I recommend that as a fun day trip from orcas. And then on day 4, would recommend getting back out on the water, but in a kayak as opposed to a whale watching boat. So a number of outfitters will do that. There's different tours you can take. But from the same spot where you caught the whale watching boat on the north of East Sound, there is a trip you can do out to Point Dowdy, which is a point on the very western tip of the northern part of the island. And so there's a park there with campgrounds that you can only access by kayak or by boat. So pretty cool spot for lunch. And if you are interested, you could pack your tent in your kayak and bring dinner out there and spend the night out there. But a really cool point. That point looks north into the west, so you can see a little bit of the islands, but a lot of what you see is open water, and then there's a lighthouse off the shore that you can see as well. So a really cool spot. And the whole way out there, headed west out to that point, is relatively large sea cliffs. So a great spot for bird watching, not just aquatic animal life, but those falcons, things like that live up in those cliffs and fish and feed in that water. So a pretty cool spot for that as well.
Got it.
Yeah. And then if you do that in the morning, I would recommend coming back. There is actually a winery on Orcas Island called Orcas Island Winery. So I would recommend doing that in the afternoon, leaning into the relaxation side of the islands. Definitely a good spot. There's also now a brewery on Orcas Island. I believe there's just one that makes their own beer. So if beer is more your style, can come back and do that right there in East Sound. And then that is my overall recommendation for more of a 4-day trip to Orcas Island.
You mentioned winery. My understanding is that each of the 3 largest islands, we didn't mention Lopez Island, which is south of Orcas Island. So Lopez and Orcas and San Juan Island each have wineries now. And there's also a cidery out by Roca Harbor in San Juan Island, if you're more of a cider fan.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think the primary grape that grows best in the San Juans is the Pinot Noir grape. So in particular,
cool, that makes sense.
If you'd like to know what type of wine they're more famous for, they make several different varieties, but Pinot Noir is the big one.
Okay. Cool. So you mentioned that's your larger itinerary. We talked before we started recording about, but what if I only had less time than that? What would you recommend doing?
Yep. And this is where now we're stretching the definition of what is a San Juan Island. But
we're doing it intentionally,
yes.
So that's okay.
Yeah. So very aware that folks are often coming from Seattle and maybe adding on the islands as a part of a larger trip.
Right.
The island that we would often take visitors to for day trips from Seattle is named Whidbey Island and is really just to the north of the greater Seattle area. It's the longest island in Washington and is one of the longer islands in the U.S., but it has some of the best vistas in the area, in my opinion, and some really interesting history and hiking, and then several pretty unique towns. And so I think you get a lot of the San Juan's feel without necessarily having to venture as far north. And then the really beautiful part of it for a day trip is there is a bridge off the island in the northern corner that can get you back to the mainland. It's a bit longer of a drive around, but you don't have to rely on the ferry timing and queuing for the ferry in order to get back. And so it's a great place to go for even just a day trip, but also a full weekend as well. There's definitely enough to do for a full weekend.
And if you were going to do that for a weekend, are there particular things you would recommend on Whidbey Island?
Yes. On Whidbey, also a very arty community. On Whidbey, there's a few towns that are pretty interesting. The town of Langley is particularly nice. So if you're going and staying, would recommend potentially staying there. or in Coupeville. Those are, I think, towns that have the best history. Coupeville has a pretty cool old wharf. That's pretty interesting. And then several of the buildings in Coupeville are quite old. So those are, I think, the towns I'd recommend staying. And then there's an inn that's outside Coupeville called the Captain Whidbey that I think is a really great example of kind of that island inn type style with cabins and rooms looking out onto the water, and then really cool grounds with a great restaurant kind of built out over the water. So really cool spot if you're looking for a specific place to go. And then on Whidbey itself, I think one of the coolest hikes in Washington is called Eby's Landing, which is on the western side of Whidbey. And so that's really the first thing I often show people when we're out there. It's this really beautiful coastal ridgeline where you'll walk up to a ridge that's maybe 100, 150 feet above the beach. And it looks like Ireland. It truly doesn't feel like you're in the United States. It's beautiful. And to your west, you've got the Olympics. To the north, you see all the San Juans laid out ahead of you. And then you can still see Mount Rainier and Mount Baker off to the south and east. And then you have the beautiful rolling farms of that part of Whidbey Island as another component of the view. So that's the first thing we often do with folks when we head out there. On the way out there, depending on how you time it, there's a place called Greenbank Farms, which has a pie bakery where you can get both slices and wholesale pies that are very good. And then they've turned part of their farm into an off-leash dog park. And so if you bring your dog, it's a great place to go for that. It's also a fun place for a walk. It's a very natural farm type environment. So a good place.
You had me at pie. So,
If you can see dogs getting to pretend like they're out on a hunt and eat pie and be in a beautiful island environment, it's a pretty good spot. So we like that, like taking people there, type of place where you can stretch the rules on at what time of day does it become socially acceptable to begin eating pie. So you can have your breakfast pie there if you're so.
I'm sorry, there's a time of day that's not socially acceptable for eating pie.
Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar with this concept, but okay.
Exactly.
Must be a Seattle thing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Maybe it's just me that has to convince myself, but we like it out there. There's another beach not far from Greenbank called Double Bluff Beach, and so that's another great spot. That looks south, but is basically a beach with a large head wall as well. But you get to walk along the beach the whole way, and you can walk for 3 or 4 miles, all in one direction. And so that's another great walk if you're on Whidbey. And then I forgot to mention when you're at Eby's Landing, there's actually, most people don't go inland from the normal hike that just walks along the coast and then comes back. But if you go, there's another trail that goes inland, and it actually goes to a cemetery that's been on the island for over 150 years. So that's an interesting place to check out. There's a cabin there that is quite old, and then some of the headstones are pretty interesting. Some of the original settlers were buried there. So that is something that's pretty interesting to see in terms of island history. And then in terms of the towns, I think Langley and Coupeville are great to stay in. Coupeville is also pretty interesting to check out and shop. And the wharf is also pretty cool for a town or kind of evening walk if you're staying. And then the other big star of Whidbey Island is Deception Pass State Park, which is the bridge that connects Whidbey to Fidalgo Island in the north. And Deception Pass Bridge is very famous. It's 2 bridges there's a massive rock in the middle of this strait between the 2 islands. So the bridge connects to the rock and then connects to Fidalgo Island. And the bridge itself is all painted green. I think it was built in the 1930s. And so it's a very interesting structure, a great place for photography. And then the water in the strait runs pretty quickly. And so I believe, especially before more mechanized boats, it was, I think, a very challenging place to get through. And is now a beautiful place to see birds. A lot of osprey, bald eagles will be flying through Deception Pass. So definitely a cool place to check out. And then north of the bridge is another section of the park called Bowman Bay that is not as famous as the bridge, because a lot of people want to come and see the bridge. They want to hike underneath the bridge and take a lot of very cool photographs. But Bowman Bay is a really stunning bay that is actually on Fidalgo Island, but would highly recommend checking that out. It's a great place for tide pooling. And then you can actually walk out to this point that really juts out into the ocean towards the west. Great views of all the San Juans. And then you can look back and see the whole bay ahead of you. So that's a really cool spot on Whidbey as well.
Got it. And now you're back up to Anacortes.
Yes.
So we've just gotten there a different way. We went the water route to get there. Assuming we started at the ferry you'd take there would be down in Mukilteo.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Close to Everett.
Yeah. And so that's probably, if you do all those things combined with taking the ferry over there in the evening, that's probably a solid day and a half, 2 days on Whidbey. You can also do whale watching from Whidbey. So that actually leaves from the Deception Pass area. So you can do that as well, even if you only have a limited amount of time. And then similar to, what we were saying earlier, you can, if you do leave the island from that area near Anacortes, you can then check out some of those things I mentioned at the beginning that are on the mainland, but are still cool coastal hiking or the Tulip Festival or things like that, depending on the time of year.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Anything else we want to do before we start to get to some of our wrap-up questions here, Alex?
I think those are the main things.
Cool.
I think there's also a winery on Whidbey. It's called the Spoiled Dog Winery. If you need a winery or vineyard on every island, so that I didn't recommend, or I do recommend, but I didn't get to. But yeah, I think that's most of what I have for the shorter kind of Whidbey Island weekend trip from Seattle.
Excellent. As we go to wrap this up, if we include the San Juans and we include Whidbey Island, and we're standing in the prettiest spot, where are we standing and what are we looking at?
I think it's on Evie's Landing. That is a truly breathtaking spot. That's one of the hikes we do all the time, all seasons, and so we're doing it several times a year. Really breathtaking spot. I think that may be the most beautiful spot in the San Juans, even though it's technically in Island County.
Okay. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in the San Juans or Whidbey Island.
Yep.
We'll include
the Puget Sound.
The Puget Sound. There you go.
The first time we went whale watching, we were with a pot of workers that were slowly making their way down what was the east side of Vancouver Island, actually. And we were watching them, but as we were watching them and they were moving down, they were between us and the shore. You could see people's patio furniture from, you could see people watching them from the shore. The fact that people get to see this from their backyard, I think, is just one of the craziest phenomenons in this region. So I think that the fact that there's folks that sit out there every day with binoculars and read their book and get to look up and see orcas is definitely something that would make you laugh and realize you're definitely there.
Very cool. And if you had to summarize the islands of the Puget Sound, let's just put it that way, in just 3 words, what 3 words are you going to use?
I worked on this for a while, but I think cozy, breathtaking adventure is what I'm going to go with to highlight the feel they have and the fact that you can have this incredible outdoor adventure and then cozy up to the fire in a great inn or have a really good meal at the end of the day. I think are also great assets of the islands.
Excellent. You mentioned a couple times that you could kayak to some islands and camp, but you didn't mention which islands those were that you had done that on.
So there's quite a few. I have actually not done that myself. My brother-in-law is really the expert in that. He actually got engaged on one of the islands that you can kayak to.
Nice.
Yeah. So there's quite a few.
Not that you're promising.
Yeah, not that would happen to everyone. Yeah. But there's quite a few smaller ones that you can do that to. And I can't rattle off all of their names. Some of them are not even named themselves, but there's plenty of guides out there how to access the different islands that do have campsites and things like that.
One of the things I was noticing is there are several of the small islands that are part of a Jones Island Marine Park or San Juan Islands National Wildlife Refuge that are completely designated as parkland. And I didn't know if that was what we were talking about, if it was some of these other small islands.
Jones, Shaw, and Cypress, I think, are 3 of the best ones for kayak tripping and more of the kind of rugged experience of setting up your tent on an island and interfacing with very few other folks. So very cool experiences as well. Haven't gotten to do that yet, though, unfortunately.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Alex Shoemann. And Alex, thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for the San Juans and Whidbey Island. The love for Puget Sound. Right. Let's do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's been a lot of fun.
She stole $6 million
From the award-winning podcast,
I'm Lacey Mosley.
a new true crime series.
They call me Scam Goddess. I'm going on a journey across America to dive into small-town swindles.
How can you not trust this local farm girl?
And big city cons.
He was pimping the congregation.
People say that would never happen to me. Never say never.
Scam Goddess, new episodes Thursdays, stream on Hulu.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
Special thanks, as always, to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. If you've had a great trip because of Amateur Traveler and you'd like to help support the show, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler to learn more. I heard from Steve about the recent show we did on Melanesia. It says, I just listened to the Melanesia podcast. It was excellent. We were there in 2018. We spent 2 months in the region and really enjoyed it. Your conversation at the end is right on. I've been retired since 2006, and we have been enjoying the world ever since. The people we travel with are similar. The challenge we face is how to get more younger people to travel. Many do, but we need many more. Luckily, our granddaughter is into travel. Have a happy holiday, Steve. Thanks so much, Steve. And we certainly have some plans to do some travel after we retire, which is coming up hopefully sooner rather than later. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral.